I'm very pleased that, I'm not going to introduce all the speakers, but I will just say a few words about Gabrielle Walker. Gabrielle's the chief scientist at Xyntéo, which is a strategic advisory organization, really working with companies to look at their future business models and ways of reinventing growth opportunities. She's also had a career in academia. She was a professor at Princeton, and she was the editor of the responsible for climate change at Nature. And her book, co-authored with David King, called The Hot Topic, was described by Al Gore as a beacon of clarity, and by the Times as a material gain for the axis of good. So, not the axis of evil. But Gabrielle, thank you very much. And Gabrielle's going to be chairing, and we have, let's call up our co-panelists now. So we have Michael Henderson from AECOM. Michael, there you are, right. Karsten Löffler from Allianz Climate Solutions. David Miles, my colleague over there, and Laure de Preux. So, Gabrielle, it's over to you now.
Thank you very much. I just said to Simon, who I'm sitting next to, that if I was not a born optimist, I'd be feeling pretty damn miserable now. And he said, well, I'm just being realistic. And I think realistic is an excellent thing to be at this point in the post-Paris euphoria and the dust settling and what we're actually going to do about it. And tomorrow, there is a signal from government. Tomorrow, 155 countries so far are committed to sign this agreement on Earth Day. Christiana Figueres is very proud of this. She says it's a record. The last record for the number of countries signing an agreement on one day was 119, and that was for the international law of the sea. So one way or another, there are signals coming out that there are governments that want to be seen to be putting themselves behind this and promoting it. And I hope that those governments are listening to Simon's message about what they do next. And I'm not entirely confident that they are, or that they will be sometime soon. But the panel that we're going to discuss at the moment, this is about capturing growth. And we need growth. It's a substance not just of governments, but of businesses, civil society organizations, how we lift people out of poverty. We all know this, providing meaningful employment, how we get the investment and creativity that we need to move forwards. And I would say that there's both a financial and moral imperative to find a way to grow right. And my organization, Xyntéo, has a conviction that we've actually been doing it wrong for quite a while in three particular axes, that the way that we grow has put in peril the relationship between us and the environment that actually sustains us, that it's also increasing levels of inequality when we ought to be focusing on the many as well as the few, both for moral and for financial reasons. And, of course, that we've been looking very much to the short term and forgetting the long term. So those three axes are the three that we want to focus on, and are working with lots of big multinational corporations to figure out how to do that. And one of the reasons for that is that there's a tired old story that investment in dealing with the environment and climate is actually economically expensive. You have to choose one or the other, right? Either you invest, you grow, you do your economic stuff, or you do this kind of nice tree-huggy thing where you look after the environment if you have some spare time, but it's expensive. That's the old, and I would say very tired story, which has now been repeatedly disproved even for the current situation, let alone for the regulations that are going to come. So that's good work that's come out of Oxford here. It's work that's come out of the UN Global Compact. It's work that's come out of the new climate economy. But basically, the evidence is incontrovertible that the way to get the growth and the way to get the investment, the creativity, and the new technology that we need is also the way to deal with the environment. I think from Paris, it's absolutely true, of course, that the INDCs, the intentional nationally determined contributions, do not add up to anywhere near what we need. It's probably more like 3.7 degrees or more, the commitments that have come from the individual governments. However, I was still very optimistic after Paris, not just because I'm a born optimist, but because I was very excited by the role that non-state actors played in that whole process. And it was very, very different from what happened in Copenhagen when we had that disastrous attempt to make a global agreement back in 2009. Because what happened in Paris was so many individual non-state actors, not just states and cities and regions and mayors, but particularly businesses were there in force saying, we are already doing this initiative. We are planning to do this initiative. We have more initiatives to do. There was one day in the middle of the sessions in Paris, I don't know if you noticed this, a whole day on the day of action, which was nothing but non-state actors. And at one point, Christiana Figueres read out all of the different initiatives that had come through the Lima initiative from the previous COP. And it took her, I don't know, maybe 8 minutes. She had pages and pages and pages just reading them out. So I mentioned that because we're here in this panel now to talk about how we get growth. And we're here on this day to talk principally about the role that business will play in not just getting the growth, but also dealing with the climate issue. And I think that role of business taking a leadership position, pushing the governments, not the other way around, pushing the governments to get the agreement, could be really the secret, could be the answer that we're looking for. I wanted to pick out, Simon was very down on oil and gas companies, saying that with, I think, a certain amount of good reason in the quotes that he was putting forward. I would also say that not all oil and gas companies are the same. We work with ones that are really working hard to try and change the situation. Not many of them from the United States, I have to say, but, you know, still working on it. Also, but look at the other companies. I mean, Apple. 100% of Apple's data centers, 100% are now running on renewable energy. 93% of all its worldwide facilities. And you know how they did that? They did that by actually collaborating with, or even in some cases, creating new solar power companies around their different installations. And they're working really hard on it. Google's going to do that now. IKEA is looking to generate all the energy used in its shops and factories from clean sources by when? 2020, 4 years' time, 2020. And they're investing $600 million, euros on wind and solar power installations. And, you know, IKEA also, this is a fantastic phrase, that they've just come up with this. They say that we've reached peak stuff, peak curtains. I love this, because now it's looking at a cyclical economy. How can we actually reinvest so that we're creating products that don't just get thrown away? Unilever, Sustainable Living Plan. Double the size of the business while reducing the environmental impact to decouple the relationship between hazards to the environment and growth. Marks & Spencer's, we're going to hear from Marks & Spencer later today. Their plan A is at the heart of the business plan. It's not something that's being done on the side. It's right there in the business plan for making money. A couple of other quick comments. Really in the last 6 months, I think, especially, this massive surge of interest from the investment community. So Mark Carney, Chairman of the Financial Stability Board and, of course, Governor of the Bank of England, he's talking about the risks to financial stability that come from not acting on climate change. Physical risks to individual installations, reputational and litigation risks, the transition risk and the possible of stranded assets. The Financial Stability Board has now set up a task force being led by Mike Bloomberg to look at exactly how companies are going to need to and be able to report how they're dealing with these risks so that investors can actually decide where to divest and where not to. And that's happening all this year, and we'll report at the end of this year. An amazing quote here from Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock. I think it's the world's biggest asset manager for investments under management. He wrote to all 500 S&P CEOs. He said, "Today's culture of quarterly earnings hysteria," his word, "is totally contrary to the long-term approach we need. Over the long term, environmental, social, and governmental issues have real and quantifiable financial impacts." Now, that's from the CEO of BlackRock to all 500 S&P CEOs. And that's just that was just in February. This is just happening in the last 6 months or so. So I am seeing some things that are different, particularly in the business community and particularly among non-state actors. And the final big story I want to highlight before we go into the panel is the new kinds of collaborations and coalitions that many of these things imply. We're working, for example, on a collaboration, Norway 2030-40. It's how a collaboration of businesses, and Statoil is actually one of those, how a collaboration of businesses can help figure out how the government can deliver on its 40% reduction target by 2030. And that's businesses saying, we're going to figure it out because that's what we need to do. Other odd kinds of coalitions, though, we're also working on an India Skills project between the IKEA Foundation, us, the UNDP, and the India Development Foundation, and a whole host of Indian businesses. Now, this is actually for developing new skills among women in India, but we're now exploring whether you can have similar kinds of collaborations looking at the energy transformation in India. It's not just going to take businesses, but it's going to take leadership from businesses and unusual kinds of collaborations. So those are some of the things that I wanted to highlight that might, I hope, cheer you up a bit and certainly cheer me up a bit. And now we're going to move into the session where we'll talk about this whole process of capturing growth. We do have a smashing panel. I'll introduce them one at a time as they give their opening statement, and then we'll have some chance for discussion. So thanks very much. Okay. So we're starting with Michael Henderson. Michael is Associate Director for Sustainability within AECOM's Design, Planning and Economics team. He's developed strategic climate mitigation and adaptation policies for more than 20 local authorities. He's worked on all sorts of things. He's a regular presenter of the Carbon Disclosure Project accredited events. And he's going to talk to us a bit about the built sector and how that affects this whole story. So, Michael, over to you for a few moments.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks for letting me talk to you today. It's interesting to, I hope to give you an interesting alternative perspective. We had a lot of discussion around energy and carbon at the moment, and I'm going to come from a slightly different perspective and talk about climate adaptation primarily and the role of cities in trying to create a more resilient cities. And for avoidance of doubt, obviously we've got a lot of business people in the room. When we talk about cities, I'm not talking about the city, as in the City of London. I'm talking about the growth of the built environment and cities. Now, I'm sure many of you are aware, 2007 was a landmark year in the evolution of humanity. It was the first year that we, as a species, decided that more of us wanted to live in our own man-made, created habitat than living out in rural environments. We moved more than 50% of us into urban environments. Today, there's about 54% of people living in cities. That's about 3.8 billion people. And this is set to increase to around 6 billion people, or just over 2/3 of the world's population by 2050. Now, undoubtedly, this shift just highlights the growing importance of cities. I think we're seeing a reduction in the importance of state actors, and actually more importance being placed on the city as an economic actor. There are, however, a lot of important differences between cities, and on a global perspective, cities are changing. According to McKinsey, over 60% of global GDP is generated from just 600 cities. In 2007, the vast majority of this 60%, 50% of total GDP, was dominated by 380 cities, all of which were in developed countries. 10%, the rest of the 10% of that 60%, was from 220 cities from developing countries. By 2025, that shift is going to change. That's going to shift. Nearly a third of these developed market cities are going to drop out of that 600, and we're going to see around 136 new cities, all from developing markets, enter that top 600. So global competition between cities is really hotting up, and I think this is where the climate change debate is key. As cities represent high concentrations of high value, both in terms of people and expensive assets, we know that climate change, including sea level rise, urban heat island effects, more intense and frequent storms, and their consequential impacts disproportionately affect the developing world. The ability to demonstrate efforts to improve climate resilience has a direct relationship on that city competitiveness. Investors are increasingly looking at how their investments, to make sure that their investments aren't exposed to the climate vulnerabilities in different cities. For example, Grosvenor have developed a resiliency index where they look at several different environmental and social indicators before they make investment decisions and look at their investment portfolio in different cities. We can also see through the development of things like the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities campaign and the UN's International Strategy for Disaster Reduction's Make My City Resilient campaign, which now has over 2,000 cities signed up. Cities are really keen to be seen to be addressing their real, or maybe even just the perceived, vulnerabilities of that city. They're literally trying to brand themselves as resilient cities, and we're working with a number of cities who are perhaps not doing that much in actually changing stuff, but they're really going for these campaigns because they want to highlight to the rest of the world that they're doing something about it. And there are tangible benefits of doing so, not least in protecting lives and livelihoods and the infrastructure. Our work with the Carbon Disclosure Project on their Healthier, Wealthier Cities report a couple of years ago, which surveyed around 200 cities in their network on their climate change policies and actions to date, show that both mitigation and adaptation measures are economically beneficial for the city. In the sort of city economy, the city budgets, on average, they're reporting nearly 40 million in savings per year from tackling climate change. And in another survey with around 800 cities from CDP, the C40, and with AECOM, over 90% of cities believe that climate change actions presented business opportunities within their city. And 63% highlighted that adaptation responsive, particularly the green ones, so vegetative ecological responses, actively help attract investment, retain talent, and having to have a noticeable impact on improving health, and therefore reducing health budget spending. But what can the built environment do? What is the built environment sector doing to sort of build resilience into cities, into new pieces of infrastructure, new regeneration? Well, I like to think there are two really interesting areas, and as an urban designer, I come from that perspective. Firstly, we're seeing better, more flexible use of planning and urban design responses to climate change, coupled with the traditional sort of more infrastructure-heavy, grey infrastructure-led responses. The idea that we can build in resiliency into our cities. One such example is the idea of something called water-sensitive urban design. And this is where we seek to have better management of the urban water cycle. So attenuating water, capturing water, cleansing that water actually within the public realm itself, taking the load off the traditional heavy infrastructure of our sewage networks, which are already at capacity and very expensive to replace. Taking pressure off wastewater treatment facilities, which have huge energy requirements, and also taking pressure off the natural environment at the same time. Secondly, and allied to this, we're in an area where there isn't the spending available that there used to be. We're seeking to better capture co-benefits associated with delivering infrastructure projects and regeneration projects. And that sort of co-benefit focus is allowing us to bring in different type of actors and potentially investors into paying for some of the infrastructure. So taking that water-sensitive urban design philosophy in managing water attenuation, quality and supply, it also helps to provide a green open space for recreation, which has a direct impact on heart disease and mental health. So we're looking at health budgets coming into paying for urban design and potentially water infrastructure within cities. It also helps reduce carbon, the urban heat island effect, all those sorts of things. Within this, we're sort of starting to see the development of new methodologies for effectively evaluating what were traditionally seen as the intangibles in placemaking. So, for example, San Francisco Public Utilities, in their sewer upgrade program, are now looking at all of the environmental and social indicators which can be impacted by the investment in different types of infrastructure to evaluate the sort of total whole life costs and benefits of environmental, social and economic impacts, as well as just purely financial. And in the UK, we've been working with Severn Trent to create the business case for this, what they call water-sensitive urban design process. So they can actually see by investing in public realm solutions, they're taking cost off their infrastructure and also providing a more climate resilient response to water management. This is associated with a move away in cities from a purely economic view of what a successful city is, what a successful place is. You probably know that London is probably got the highest GDP of any city in the world. Yet 1 in 5 people, 20% of people in London are classed as NDs. They have, they're employed, but they have no disposable income or savings. And they're the employed people. There are a lot of unemployed people here as well. So those people can't actually actively engage within the city. And these cities are increasingly recognizing that if they're going to attract the best talent, they have to do more than provide somewhere where you can potentially earn money and just survive rather than thrive. So cities are increasingly recognizing this change in how they present themselves to attract that globally mobile pool and respond to the livability question, of which resilience is obviously one of them. So if we can have resiliency responses, which are also public realm responses, we're getting a great response. And I think this is where the built environment sector really needs to focus its attention. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Michael. Next, we have Karsten Löffler from Allianz Climate Solutions. He's Managing Director of Allianz Climate Solutions, which is Allianz Group's Centre of Competence for Climate Change and renewable energy, and he's responsible for integrating climate change into Allianz's core business. So over to you, Karsten.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. Great to be here with you, and I liked your statement very much. It was really enlightening. And one remark to that, what came to my mind then is Stone Age didn't end because of lack of stones. So that came naturally. Maybe we will come back to that in 20 years' time. So let's see. So I'm here speaking on behalf of the financial sector, and not of the entire financial sector, but with a perspective coming from the financial sector, of course. So when we think about what can be our contribution, what can we bring to the table, so that's first, as an insurance company, we come with a very long-term view. So we are a patient investor, basically. And we perceive our role as very supportive to the transformation that will be inevitable. So when you look at the science, Martin was describing very nicely, I find, again. So we understand that in the second half of the century, we will have to be at net zero carbon. And that's what we already think about, how to get there. So it's not coming tomorrow, but in a few decades. And that's not too long a period in time. So our role is about lubricating change as well. It's as well about understanding the risks on this route. And you just very nicely described what is now happening, led by Mike Bloomberg with the Financial Stability Task Force on understanding climate risks better. So we are looking very closely at that. I just commented the phase 1 paper yesterday night, so, so that's pretty close to us as well. Having said that, I'd like to use my 5 minutes coming with 2 examples. And that's first, looking back to what came out of Paris with the national determined contributions. Our understanding coming from that is that it means huge infrastructure investments over the next decade, and how this is going to be financed. And it's not only about developed countries, it's very much about developing countries. And you only have to look at the NDCs. Most of them, or many of them, are conditional with respect to financing. And that's both an opportunity for us as an investor, but it's a huge challenge as well. That's because it's kind of uncharted territory for us as a very conservative investor. And we have to find our ways and to understand the risks and how these risks can be managed. And my perception is we might not be able to do this alone. There has to be a very kick-started, maybe, collaboration with the public sector, with multilateral development banks, with the likes of KfWs, maybe, the Green Investment Bank, maybe. This is very important to understand what risks the private sector can take, what are the business models with respect to infrastructure, where are the cash flows going to come from? That's basically the question, always. When you look at resilience investments, these are naturally public sector investments. But when the private sector needs to come into that to finance, to provide finance, and we are looking for finance, for good finance, for return. This is the big conundrum we see coming forward, and where much work has to be done, and where also we have to change, because we just wait for investment proposals, and then we say yes or no, but maybe we have to become more engaged in developing it. But that's a huge challenge for us as well. Second example I'd like to present is coming to growth. It's not about sustaining growth, but it's also about avoiding decrease in GDP in societies, in countries. And why is that important? It comes with natural catastrophes, and it comes with protection and with risk transfer, for example, to the insurance market. It's very known that with higher insurance penetration in countries, like we have in many developed countries, that economies recover faster. And where this is not in place, you will see prolonged periods of lower growth or very much reduced growth that was impacted by big natural catastrophes. You see this in many developing countries, and to come back to the growth path again can be much quicker with risk transfer solutions. But risk transfer is not a means in itself. When you are when you start thinking about it, it's mostly about understanding risk better. It's risk assessment in the first place, then risk reduction to make protection cheaper, to make it more affordable, and then think about prevention. And here again, the private sector won't be able to do all this alone. So it's very much about collaborating with the public sector, and that's happening already. But it needs to be scaled up considerably. So my two messages are the private sector, us as an insurance company with a strong investment arm, with a strong insurance arm, so we have a role to play. It has to be profitable in the end, that's clear. But we will have to make our contribution to come to that place and to invest in furthering our understanding and furthering our knowledge as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Karsten. And now we're going to go into the panel discussion where we'll bring in our other two speakers as well. And you know, my brief was not to try and come up with all the solutions for how we capture growth in this panel session, which I was quite relieved to hear, but maybe to open up some of the issues that are going to be discussed throughout the day and throughout the next weeks and months and years. So I'll go next to Professor David Miles, who's here at the Imperial College Business School. He has been, between 2009 and 2015, a member of the Monetary Policy Committee at the Bank of England. He works on the connection between monetary policy and financial stability. It could scarcely be more relevant and important right now. For example, looking at the setting of bank capital requirements. David, we have been talking about the relationship between dealing with the climate and the effects of climate and financial stability, and we're just hearing about how to try and manage risk within that. What's your reflections?
Well, so I'm an economist here at Imperial. So that makes it sound like I'm introducing myself at Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm an economist. And like alcoholics, economists are often quite gloomy. And I thought it might be helpful to sort of pose the question of climate change in the context of growth in the following way. And this is a gloomy economist's back-of-the-envelope calculation. Right now, I think I'm right in saying, roughly, that annual CO2 emissions are running at about 50 billion tons. If you look over the next 30-odd years, say you go ahead to 2050, and you assume that world GDP grew in line with the typical experience over the last 40, 50 years or so, it'll grow by about 3% a year, maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less. The wonders of compounding are that if you grow at 3% a year for the next, say, 35 years, the level of GDP would be 3 times what it is today. So if you were trying to hold global CO2 emissions just at the current level, forget about reducing them, you have to, and GDP is 3 times bigger in 2050 or so, then it doesn't take a genius to work out that emissions per unit of GDP have to be 1/3 of what they are today. Of course, that's a very bad scenario, because if we go back to these, what does it take to give you a reasonable chance of keeping the rise in temperature to 2 degrees or less? I think you probably need to have global CO2 emissions annually probably less than 20 billion. So you need to reduce the aggregate level of global CO2 emissions to 1/3, say, its current level, rather than just keep it constant. And just keeping it constant means that you need emissions per unit of GDP to be only 1/3. You put those two things together, and you need CO2 emissions per unit of GDP by 2050 to be 1/3 of 1/3 of what it is today. So you need a 90% reduction, roughly, bit of a back-of-the-envelope thing. You need a 90% reduction in CO2 emissions per unit of GDP. So it strikes me, so this is a long-winded way of posing a question for the audience. It strikes me that one of 3 things is going to happen. Either you get that sort of growth in GDP, but the reduction in emissions per unit of GDP is nowhere near that, in which case that's a horrible outcome. and I sell my house, which is currently on the sunset levels, very quickly, and buy something in the Peak District, like now. Or you sacrifice GDP, so you get no growth in GDP, or possibly a decline, which, given the population is going to go up, means that GDP per capita across the world will be on a declining trajectory. That's pretty horrible as well. Third outcome, the only good one, you get fantastic reductions in carbon emissions per unit of GDP. And I think the big question is which of those three, roughly speaking, mutually exclusive and almost exhaustive scenarios is the more likely one. Let me give 2 reasons for being very pessimistic and 3 reasons for being very optimistic. And I don't know how to weight these things together, but it's one way maybe of generating a discussion. So, reason for being pessimistic number 1, which has been mentioned already, which is that oil prices are very low. And it may be no fluke that oil prices are low in an environment where there is an increasing awareness that if you're going to avoid climate catastrophe, you can't burn more than a smallish proportion of known reserves. Of course, as people, it's kind of a rather unfortunate paradox to get into there. The more people believe that, the lower the price of oil is today and the greater the incentive people have to use it right now. That's extraordinarily unhelpful. Second reason to be pessimistic, public awareness of risk, not just about climate issues, but just about general things, seems to me pretty dire. Let me give you one example, which actually does feed back into the climate thing. The perceived dangers from past accidents of using nuclear power. I think there's a perception amongst many people that nuclear is extraordinarily dangerous, and accidents in the past show just how dangerous using nuclear is. And you can see it in the reaction in Germany, for example, after the Fukushima disaster. There's a big change in German policy, and now I believe I'm right in saying, building coal-fired power stations and very much moving away from nuclear. If you look at the 2 big accidents in the last 30 or 40 years, Chernobyl, Fukushima, I think most people would be very surprised by estimates of the number of people that died as a result of those tragedies. It's extraordinarily low, and yet there's a perception, I think, in the world that those show that nuclear is extraordinarily dangerous. 3 reasons, very briefly, to be more optimistic. One is that people's awareness of risks can change very profoundly in relatively short periods of time. I mean, I can remember, many people in the room remember, 30 or 40 years ago, most people's attitude toward drink driving was, yeah, it's perfectly safe, and it's okay and acceptable. And now that's just completely unacceptable. People had completely different attitudes towards smoking. 30 or 40 years ago, I think people would be absolutely amazed to see where we are in the UK right now, where it's difficult to buy cigarettes and there are all kinds of terrible health warnings on them, and quite rightly so. So awareness of risks can change, and as it changes, I think opposition to measures to dramatically reduce emissions will itself change, so that getting rid of subsidies for use of carbon and raising the price of carbon, politically very difficult at the moment, can become far easier as people's attitudes change. Second big reason to be optimistic, technology may drive enormous changes in the cost of producing energy through clean sources. And this is the most optimistic of my 3 reasons to be optimistic, which is that there may be something like a Moore's law at work on technological advance in using clean energy. Third reason to be optimistic, this sounds bizarre, but I think there's something to it, which is pollution. The quality of life, as many people will know better than I do, the quality of life in some cities is hugely damaged by pollution. That's particularly true in China and in parts of India. And I think cities and the governments of the countries in which those cities sit are very likely to do something about that rather quickly. And in fact, they are doing something about it. Now, that's not directly, it seems to me, a concern about climate change, and it's much more a concern that there is an immediate and local problem you can do something about. But as a byproduct of dealing with pollution, I think you do something extraordinarily helpful, potentially, in reducing carbon emissions. So there it is. Look, I've got 3 reasons to be optimistic, 2 to be pessimistic. I have no idea how to weight these things together, and I'm hoping that the discussion we're now going to enter into will help me work out, you know, whether I should net be optimistic or pessimistic.
You should always be optimistic, in my opinion. We'll come back to this at the end about the relative levels of optimism and pessimism we feel like employing. But that's brought us very nicely into Laure, Dr. Laure de Preux, who is she's here at Imperial too, health and environmental economist. We've been talking quite a lot, Laure, about the health effects of climate change and this sort of side effect of acting on local pollution can also make a difference. And Michael mentioned the kind of the byproducts of bringing in sort of health investment or health approaches to dealing with climate change. So what's your perspective on the impacts, risks, opportunities in the health sector?
Well, I wanted to present some reason to worry about health and climate change, and then end up with a more optimistic view on why we should take into account health in the climate change debate. Health is important because it's the ultimate victim of climate change, but it's also our most important asset. We've discussed the effect of climate change. Climate change affects health in many different ways by extreme weather events, flooding, drought, sea level rise. All these have global effect on health, but also in our region. And as such, I think it represents a threat because its effects are visible now. It affects the people, vulnerability, it affects their health, it affects delivery of healthcare. However, I think it also represents an opportunity to think about how we can improve the healthcare sector and how we can adapt and take into account those changes to do better. When we think about climate change, we think about reducing greenhouse gas emissions globally. But in the case of healthcare, it's a local problem because we are all, as Martin has shown in one of his graphs, the effect of the weather on the Earth is very different with different regions. And also the way climate change affects health, it depends on the local population. At the macro level, if you want a very simple example, the difference between developing country and developed country. Developed countries suffer from climate change in terms of increased cardiovascular disease, more allergy, mental health issues, whereas developing countries suffer from a change in the distribution of disease. Vector-borne disease, waterborne disease are the ones that are the mostly affected by climate change. So if you want just in a nutshell why we should care about climate change and health is because health is important and is our most important assets. But instead of saying it globally, we should think about health locally and find local solutions and find healthcare systems that are able to respond to the local need of the population. Okay. That's a message I wanted to...
Thanks very much, Laura. So these are quite a divergent range of approaches to the same issue of trying to capture growth. I think one of the things that I'm seeing in this is the message that I mentioned at the beginning, which is different kinds of collaborations and how those might come into play. Michael, when you were talking, you said something slightly chilling about working with cities that want to be seen to be resilient, even if they're not actually acting. This kind of, I don't know if that's not greenwash. It's more like a safety wash or something. But to what extent does it really require those kinds of cross-sectoral collaborations to make those things happen? To turn it from safety wash into something real?
Yeah, I think it comes back to the last point that was made about pollution, really, in that cities want to attract talent, and talent is mobile, and so people want to be going where they perceive that they are safe and in a healthy environment. So if we're going to attract the best talent, we have to have more than just the latest technology. It has to be somewhere people want to live. Ultimately, people go where they want to live. So I think so I'd wholeheartedly agree with that. But in terms of collaboration and cooperation, which I think in relation to that particular point around resilience, I think I made the point really to say that they're jumping on the bandwagon very early on, these cities, and I think that, you know, solution will come through, because I don't think that level of investment will come. So I think they do need to be they do need to sort of address those issues. The cities which are doing it well, so the Melbournes, the San Franciscos, and the like, are very much going through a collaborative approach. So San Francisco, for example, has in its sewer upgrade program, which is a £16 billion program of its sewers, because they're becoming inundated with seawater as well as being overflowed by sewage. The upgrade that they can't afford that as a city. So basically, there's two sort of collaborative things they've done. One is they said, well, what is the impact on business if we get inundation and we have to shut down the sewer system? And they went out to the 10 biggest businesses in the area and said, what's the cost of keeping that as the current program, and what would be the saving to you if we reduce that to that 6-month pause or whatever to a 2-week pause? And they said, well, it'd be this amount, and all of a sudden the investment flowed in from the business community to provide sewer upgrade to San Francisco. They've also got public bonds. So as a citizen of a city, I can invest in green bonds for that city and get a return back on future investment into adaptation techniques.
So those are quite innovative financing approaches. What do you think about the capacity for being able to do that more widely? David?
Well, I think my own view, probably highly simplistic, is that really it all keeps coming back to technology. And that if technological advance is sufficiently rapid, then it's very easy to finance, or the likelihood of technological advance in producing energy with low emissions. If the prospect of that is sufficiently great, financing will flow to research and development, and it will all play out rather well. Which is why I come back to the question of whether it is hopelessly optimistic or actually quite realistic to think that some version, a milder version of Moore's law might be true in many of the technologies. I'm painfully aware that there are lots of people in the room who know infinitely more about this than I do. My impression is that on something like solar, the costs of producing energy from solar power, those costs have come down more than might have been expected over the last 5 or 10 years. And maybe that will continue to be true. And if it is, there's the potential that actually this what seems like an enormously daunting problem of bringing down CO2 emissions by, let's say, 90% relative to GDP, actually happens in a way that's relatively pain-free and doesn't involve a sacrifice in terms of trends in GDP per capita. But I'd be very keen to hear people, if there are thoughts on that sort of Moore's law question, if you will.
I think that it's very clear that the technological cost curves have taken quite a few people by surprise and have really plummeted very spectacularly. And there's plenty of places now where solar is actually on a par with fossil fuels on the grid. But in the specific question of thinking about innovative ways to collaborate, and especially to be able to release money, Karsten, you were talking about how you're convinced that the private sector can't do this alone. And it's not just about getting the investment, it's also about handling the risk, right?
Yes, risk is coming up as part of the equation very quickly. And
pricing risk is your job, right?
Of course, yes. And then you have to understand what the risk actually is. And hopefully you understand the risk. Maybe you don't always understand it properly. You will know afterwards. But anyhow, see, the big question is you have to have, in the investment community, people that understand what can be done and how it can be done. Mm-hmm. So what is pretty clear, mostly, but then it's about roles and responsibilities. Who's actually developing the infrastructure projects we need? Who's taking the lead on them? And then at some point, throughout the investment value chain, that's how I call it, see, you have a project developer and you have an institutional investor very right at the end of the investment value chain. See, this is us maybe a bit too complacent, sitting back in the deck chair and looking, okay, what's coming to us? And then say, okay, now it ticks a box, or no, you don't like it. In that respect, coming back to your question with respect to collaboration, I try to be pretty vocal about both camps, the institutional investor camp and maybe broadly based governments, project developers, so both have to leave their kind of fortified camps and have to move more closely together.
Why do you need the public sector for this?
See, when I think about our very conservative investment approach, then think about us investing large scale in developing countries, with our liabilities sitting mostly maybe in the euro area in the US dollar area. So then you have to bring this, to match the gap, first with the foreign exchange risk. That's kind of the dominant risk that easily can destruct your value generation.
The exchange meaning the currency?
Currency risk, yeah. And then, there's quite a comfort zone that's quite immediately left with our investment professionals that perceive some of the political risks as too big to be investable. And here, the big question, or the decisive question, is about to bring the public sector together with the private sector to entice the public sector to take the risk that only the public sector can take, and to leave all the risks, technology and so on. So there's huge parts of the risk that can stay with the private sector.
Sure, okay. We have time for like 1 or 2 questions. So does anyone have a question they want to ask? There at the back. The gentleman here at the back.
Hi there. Thank you very much. Really interesting. And kind of following on from David's simplicity, the underlying assumption in the discussion is that growth can get us out of this. But if you sort of take the Einstein quote that you can't solve a problem from the same thinking that created it, and also the David Attenborough quote, anybody who believes in infinite growth on a finite planet is either mad or an economist. Do you an assumption that business can evolve? Do you think that there's an opportunity for businesses to evolve, to consider that growth is not the answer, and that growth, they might move to be steady state or even decline? Is that a possibility that growth is in question?
That's a question for our business representatives. What do you think? Michael, Karsten?
Well, not business, but I would pick up on the point that was made a minute ago about technology and trying to answer your question. We seem to automatically go to technology as one of the biggest ways of resolving this problem. We're going to design infrastructure which is so much more efficient. We have to ask the question prior to that is presumably rather than using energy, rather than using alternative forms of energy, let's just not use so much energy in the first place. And the only way we can do that is through high quality design and good quality design. Cities in Europe use about half the CO2 per unit of GDP than cities in America, and that comes down to their form, which makes them function in a very different way. Sort of modern infrastructure techniques, the sort of use of natural processes to manage all of our sewage outfall, can do it with a sort of third of the amount of carbon previously. So I think actually the solutions of the innovation is actually not necessarily going to more technical solutions, but actually coming back to some very untechnical solutions and very sort of passive solutions. And I think so in terms of decoupling ourselves from carbon, I think the only way we can do it is by more attention into the way in which we design ourselves in our urban form. I'm not sure we can do it completely when we have a trajectory to 9 billion people by 2050.
Karsten?
Very quickly, this question is very important, I find. See, it leads to what is the right metric? Is GDP the right metric for measuring what we are after? And you can question it, and I can easily see this. Ultimately, as I see it, it's linked to how we want to distribute wealth and welfare in the end. So I would like to brings us back to the audience, say, is GDP the right measure for us? And maybe not.
So we need growth, but maybe we need to measure it differently. So one more question there, and then we'll need to wrap up. It's just...
Yeah, sorry, it's a similar question to that, but looking at it from a population point of view. Whenever we look at sort of the demographic curves of country, there always seems to be a great fear of a levelling out or an inversion of that demographic curve. But actually, from a climate point of view, that's a desired outcome. You know, total emissions is average emissions times number of people. So if we can somehow reduce the number of people through sort of education, through contraception, you know, is the economic growth model fit for purpose in terms of you know, is expectations from society? Do we always need, you know, that demographic curve to look like a triangle, or can we move to a point where, you know, longer term we're looking at a more sustainable level of population?
David?
Well, I think just on the sort of general issue about growth, is growth consistent with avoiding disaster? I mean, what is not consistent with avoiding climate disaster, I think, is what you might call dirty growth. In other words, growth where the emissions per unit of GDP doesn't decline very much from where it is at the moment. I mean, if there isn't a decline in that ratio, it's blindingly obvious that growth at the sort of rates that we've seen over the last century or so is completely inconsistent with avoiding disaster. So the question is about what kind of growth can you get? And it comes back to this issue about, can you get clean growth? Clean growth is win-win. And I think I'm sounding like a parrot repeating myself. That comes down to a question of technology. Can you reduce very dramatically the ratio between GDP and emissions?
We got that. So it's about breaking the rules, breaking that relationship. And on the, do you have something that you want to add, Laura?
From the health perspective, I think it's the same. It goes in the same way, right? We need to think growth, but we need to change about. It's a lot about change in the case of health and adapting.
I mean, I think in that context, when we're thinking about the relationship between pollution and growth, it's what we put in the equation. It's how we add it up. And on the topic of population, I'd say we know how to reduce population, and that's educate girls. And that's got to be very much a part of the whole story, which is why we're doing the India Skills project in India. I'm going to say we'll have to stop now. I want one comment from each of the panelists, and it's very, very brief. I just want to know the answer to one question, because this has come up repeatedly throughout the morning, and I probably will continue after that. So, optimistic or pessimistic?
Optimistic.
Karsten?
I'm very optimistic because technology will kick in and will bring us to the right path.
David?
52% optimistic, 48% pessimistic.
Laura, at least that's on the right balance. Laura?
Generally optimistic.
Generally optimistic. That's quite encouraging, because what I was going to say is one of my favourite lines around all of this is that people say to me, how can you be so optimistic when things can seem so bleak? And my answer is, pessimism is a luxury that I don't think we can afford right now. So let's try and keep the optimism up for the rest of the day. Thank you very much for your time.